Hello there, you're listening to the planet's memory, where time breathes and the earth remembers. What if rivers have been speaking in a grammar older than names, and the planet has simply learnt to call it nature? Wherever you are tonight, I'm glad you're here. Let the room be dim. Let the day loosen its grip. Let the mind, so often tightened like a fist, open again, slowly, as though it has been remembering how. This is the language of rivers. Do our waterways follow a lost civilization's map? A documentary for sleep. A midnight meditation told in the hush between raindrops. A science story carried not by lectures but by current. Not by proof but by patient wonder. In the beginning, only one idea needs to be held, and even that can be held lightly. Some patterns are not designed, some are discovered, and sometimes the difference is only a dream away. Tonight's profound scientific idea will move like water through stone. Emergence. The way simple rules repeated across long stretches of time can carve patterns that resemble intention. The way river networks can look like writing. The way landscapes can seem like memory. The way a planet, without planning, can still produce something that feels like a map. And as sleep approaches, the rivers will begin to speak in their oldest voice, not as lines on paper, but as gravity's handwriting. Midnight will not be rushed, neither will the water. What if Earth once knew something and forgot? The question does not arrive like thunder. It arrives like water. Quiet. Quiet. Patient. Uninvited. It seeps beneath the noise and settles where the oldest thoughts live, in the softened chambers behind the eyes. Let the world outside continue being the world. Let engines, distant laughter, late elevators and stray sirens do what they do. None of it needs an answer. None of it needs to be carried. Night is not a problem to solve. Night is a place to return to. In that returning, a river appears. Not yet as a ribbon seen from above. Not yet as a blue line on a map. Not yet as a name spoken by mouths that come and go. A river begins as a feeling in the air, a gathering, a pressure, a promise that cannot be signed, only repeated. Rain does not fall with intention. It falls with obedience. It listens to the weight of clouds and the cold mathematics of altitude. It becomes droplets because the sky cannot hold everything forever. Even the atmosphere must exhale. Even the heavens must let go. At first, water is scattered, a million separate arrivals. Each drop touches the earth like a small and temporary thought, bright for a moment, then gone. Some vanish into leaves, some sink into soil, some cling to stone and linger, trembling, undecided, until the next drop arrives and persuades it to move. And then, without ceremony, the first throat of water forms. Not a river yet, not even a stream. Only a thin agreement between gravity and terrain, a shallow crease that begins to prefer itself. A line that becomes easier to follow than to resist. This is how the planet writes. Not in a single stroke, but in repetition. Not in declarations, but in habits. Time does not pass. It settles. A hillside seen in daylight seems still. But stillness is only the speed of changes too slow to witness. Under the skin of grass and root, under the dust that pretends to be permanent, the ground is always making small concessions. A grain shifts, a pebble rolls, a crack opens its mouth a fraction wider. Water returns again, and again, and again. Each visit is gentle, but gentleness repeated becomes a force. The softest thing on earth finds the hardest thing on earth and begins to edit it, not with violence, with persistence. With the quiet authority of a rule that never gets tired, a drop slides down a slope. It meets another drop. They become a thin thread. The thread becomes a trickle. The trickle begins to murmur, and the murmur becomes a faint direction, a suggestion strong enough to be obeyed. In that obedience, the land starts to change its own mind. The soil loosens where the water prefers to pass. The path deepens. The path becomes more attractive to the next rain. And in this loop, this self-reinforcing hymn, something like a sentence begins. A river network looks like language because it is made the way language is made, by repetition, by constraint, by the endless shaping of breath against a limited throat. But the river does not know it is speaking. The world of stone does not need awareness to create structure. It only needs laws. It only needs the patient physics of downhill. It only needs time long enough for small things to become large. Somewhere in the mind of the sleeping listener, the old longing stirs. The wish that patterns are proof, that beauty implies a builder, that the elegant branching of waterways is a signature left by hands that vanished before history learned to write. It is a tender longing, a human longing. The desire to believe that someone came first, someone wise and quiet, someone who carved the continent into meaningful corridors, someone who drew a map that rivers still follow like faithful animals. And yet, the rivers existed before any name for map. Rivers existed before any mouth shaped the word civilization. They existed as soon as rain existed, as soon as slopes existed, as soon as gravity began its endless work of reminding matter where down is. The question, then, becomes less accusatory, less like a challenge, more like a lullaby asked in darkness. If no one designed the rivers, why do they look designed? In answer, the night offers a different kind of intelligence, one that does not think in plans, but in pressures. A planet does not need to imagine outcomes to produce them. A planet only needs to obey itself. A river basin forms like a slow decision. The high places send water toward the low places. The low places accept it, and in accepting, they deepen. The borders between basins, the invisible ridgelines where one raindrop must choose between two destinies, rise like quiet walls made not of brick, but of geometry. Some borders are sharp, some are subtle, some shift over centuries like sleeping bodies changing position without waking. And through it all, water continues, faithful to the simplest instruction: move downhill. Find the easiest way, return. Return. That is the rule. That is the spell, the branching pattern, the one that resembles roots, veins, lightning. Emerges because it is efficient, because it is what happens when flow spreads across a surface and gathers itself again, because energy prefers not to waste itself. The river is not choosing beauty. Beauty is what efficiency looks like when witnessed by a mind that aches for meaning. Even so, something haunting remains, because the river does not merely flow across land. The river remembers the land's weaknesses. It finds the fractures. It follows old faults in bedrock, like fingertips reading a scar. It sinks into places where stone is softer, where ancient pressures already did the work of breaking. Water is not a historian, but it behaves like one. It traces the past not out of reverence, but because the past left grooves. A continent is never a blank page. Beneath forests and cities, beneath farms and highways, beneath the thin skin of present time, there are older lines, buried channels, glacial scratches, lithic seams, the ghost geometry of vanished mountains and forgotten seas. Water arrives and reads those lines without knowing it is reading, so a river can appear to follow a map because the map was already there, written by tectonics, by uplift, by the slow violence of plates colliding, by the long sinking of basins, by the sedimentation of epochs. The lost civilization is not a people. It is time itself. It is geology. It is the planet's deep habit of leaving traces. Extinction does not only happen to creatures, it happens to landscapes. It happens to worlds. A river can once have run where a desert now sleeps. A river can once have fed a sea that is now a salt memory in stone. The planet has revised itself countless times, each revision layered over the last. Each older draft still faintly present beneath the newer ink, and still tonight's central idea drifts closer, quiet as a closing eyelid. Emergence, the way complex patterns rise from simple rules. The way order can appear without an architect. The way a river network can resemble a planned system without ever having been planned. The way the mind sees meaning in branching lines and feels, just for a moment, that something is calling back. In the dark, that feeling is not wrong. It is simply unfinished. It is a door left slightly open. The rivers have more to say, but what the planet buried, it never truly forgot. A river never begins where it is seen. The visible channel, silver in daylight, ink dark at night, is only the last confession. The true beginning is quieter. It is hidden in the first soft surrender of soil, in the way a hillside, tired of holding itself together, allows one grain to loosen. Then another. Then a thin seam of weakness, so small it could be mistaken for nothing, becomes the first invitation. Water accepts invitations, not out of kindness. Out of law, gravity is not a force with a face, but it behaves like an ancient vow. Down is always down, even when the world changes names, even when continents drift like slow animals, even when glaciers arrive and leave without apology. The pull remains. The pull is the simplest song in the universe, and water has always known the words, so the first channel is not carved by certainty, but by return. A drop arrives. The earth drinks it or refuses it. A second drop arrives and meets the first in a dark pour between grains. The third drop arrives and the pour becomes a passage. The passage becomes a habit. The habit becomes a corridor. In that corridor, the world begins to resemble intention. This resemblance is the birthplace of the myth. Somewhere in the story of the species, always hungry for patterns, always reaching for the comfort of authorship, there is the old idea that a perfect shape must have had a maker, that branching must be a plan, that a network must be an artifact, that a river basin, seen from above, is too elegant to be only physics, and because the mind longs for ancestry, it invents one, a lost civilization, a forgotten survey, an ancient intelligence that laid invisible roads for water to follow. It is a haunting thought, not because it is true, but because it is tender. It treats the landscape like a relic. It turns continents into temples. It imagines that beneath the ordinary world there is a hidden blueprint, as if Earth itself once belonged to someone else. But rivers do not belong. Rivers pass through. Rivers borrow shape and return it changed. A river does not remember the way a mind remembers. It does not keep a library of days. It does not hold photographs of former bends. It does not mourn the way it used to run. The river's memory is simpler, older, and more relentless. It remembers the easiest path. The easiest path is not a moral idea. It is an energetic one. Flow prefers to spend less friction, time, less climbing, less struggle against the grain of stone. The river is an accountant of effort, endlessly balancing its ledger, endlessly revising its route to pay the smallest cost. And because that rule repeats, the repeating produces beauty. Time doesn't pass, it gathers. In a small valley, in an unnamed fold of terrain, a stream begins to cut, not quickly, not in the way the eye expects violence to look. The cutting is almost ceremonial. Water lifts a grain and carries it away as if it were nothing. 1,000 grains become a hollow. 1,000 hollows become a groove. A groove becomes a channel. A channel becomes a future that grows more certain with every storm. The banks learn to lean inward. The bed learns to deepen. The surrounding ground learns, slowly, that resistance is expensive. This learning is not conscious. It is sculptural. It is the education of matter through repetition. And soon, other streams arrive. Little threads of rainwater that once wandered alone, now drawn toward the growing certainty. They join. They merge. They become a single voice with many throats. A confluence is not merely a meeting, it is a decision finalized. Two separate histories, two separate paths of erosion, two separate accumulations of silt, touch and become one. The river grows older in an instant, not because time increased, but because information did. A river is information moving downhill. It carries the mountain in dissolved minerals. It carries the forest in tannins and leaf rot. It carries the sky in the memory of storms. It carries the invisible, isotopes, salts, tiny living bodies that drift like soft punctuation. And the land reads what the river carries by the changes it leaves behind. A bend tightens, a bank collapses, a bar of sediment forms, like a quiet sentence end. Language appears again, not as metaphor now, but as a sensation, because the river network from above truly resembles writing, branching strokes, loops, intersections, long lines that thin into hairline tributaries and thicken again into confident channels. The resemblance is so strong that it can feel like a message. But messages require intent, and the river has none. The river does not encode. It reveals. It reveals the terrain's rules, the substrate's softness, the faults and folds hidden under the skin. It reveals the invisible architecture already present in stone. So if rivers sometimes look like they follow a civilization's map, it may be because maps and rivers are siblings, born from the same hunger to find pathways through complexity. A map is a promise that the world can be simplified. A river is proof that the world can be simplified, not by thought, flow. And then comes the deeper whisper, older than any city, about how landscapes are never truly new. Even in places that seem untouched, there are buried outlines, ancient channels filled with sediment, paleovalleys sealed beneath lava, riverbeds stranded by uplift, left high and dry like abandoned roads. The planet keeps these ghosts the way the body keeps old scars, not as decoration, but as structure. A scar changes how tissue stretches. A buried channel changes how groundwater moves. A forgotten valley changes where the next river will prefer to be born. So the present river is never fully present. It is braided with the past. This is the true haunting. Not that a lost civilization mapped the water, but that the earth itself has been mapping and remapping since before thought existed to witness it. The map is not paper. The map is tendency. Some truths are not lost. They are simply folded beneath silence. In that folding, the night becomes geologic. The mind, easing towards sleep, begins to sense time not as minutes but as layers. A single raindrop is no longer small. It is a participant in an ancient ritual, the slow translation of height into distance, of stone into sand, of mountain into ocean. And if the river resembles a sentence, then it is a sentence written by the oldest editor. Gravity, erosion, return. The first throat of water keeps opening again and again wherever rain meets slope. It opens in alpine cracks and city gutters. It opens in deserts during brief storms and in jungles where the air is never fully dry. Each time the same rule begins, the same scripture, and the land, always listening, shapes itself to the sound. But what the planet buried, it never truly forgot, and the next bend in the story is already forming quietly downstream. Somewhere far above the river's visible body, where the air is thinner and the stones are still learning how to be cold, the land holds its breath in ridgelines. There, rain is not yet a story. It is only a consequence. A cloud arrives heavy with unspoken oceans. It meets a spine of mountain. It cools. It yields. And the yielding becomes 1,000 small impacts, soft as fingertips on dust. At first, nothing seems to happen. A slope receives water the way an old page receives ink. Quietly, without applause, the surface darkens. The scent of minerals lifts, faint and honest. In tiny hollows, droplets gather like unclaimed beads. In tiny cracks they vanish, sliding into the unseen rooms beneath stone. The world always has an unseen interior. Under soil, under root, under the first layers of decay that make forests feel alive, there are long corridors where water travels without light. There are hidden seams where it lingers, pressed between grains like a memory kept in the mouth and never spoken. This is not the river, not yet, but it is the river's sleep. It is the river before it becomes a line anyone can follow. Then, somewhere, the ground refuses. A clay layer turns water away. A bedrock shelf sends it sideways. A saturated slope can no longer swallow another drop, and the water, obedient to the oldest instruction, moves. Not quickly, not like a chase. Like a decision made so slowly it almost resembles stillness. A sheen forms. A thin film, a quiet, sliding skin that begins to collect itself. The film thickens into threads, and the threads begin to prefer certain micro-valleys, slight depressions no larger than a hand's shadow. The land, without speaking, offers pathways. The water, without thanking, accepts them. This is how maps are born, without cartographers. Not with ink, with preference. Some slopes are rougher than others, and roughness slows flow, steals energy, makes water pause. Some slopes are smoother, and the water slides across them like a thought that cannot be held. Some soils are loose and drink deeply, some are dense and resist. And the river's earliest shape is nothing more than this negotiation, this silent bargaining between texture and gravity. A human eye lifted high enough, above trees, above weather, above the small distractions of a single day, might see the branching begin, might see the delicate tributaries gather toward a main stem like veins gathering toward a heart, might feel the strange certainty of the pattern, might feel in the body the old suspicion that something so organized must be guided. But organization is not always guidance. Sometimes organization is simply what remains after chaos repeats long enough to find its favorite shape. In the beginning, water does not carve a channel. It searches, it explores, not with curiosity, but with inevitability. It spreads thin, then concentrates. It tries one path, then another, until the landscape teaches it which way costs less. And once the cheaper path is found, repetition makes it real. Repetition makes it deep. A shallow groove is only a suggestion, but water loves suggestions. Water returns to them, again and again, until suggestion becomes certainty and certainty becomes a boundary. The groove deepens. The banks sharpen. The flow is held in place by the very excavation it created. Time does not pass. It commits, and in the committing, the river begins to look older than it is, because it begins to hold shape. It begins to insist on its own existence. It begins to tell everything around it, softly but continuously, this way. The land listens. A hillside that once let water wander now begins to channel it. A patch of grass that once drank rain evenly now receives less, because the water has learned to concentrate elsewhere. Roots grow differently. Soil dries in one place and stays damp in another. Life rearranges itself around the new sentence being written, and still the sentence is not meant. This is the part that aches if it is held too tightly, because meaning feels like warmth. Meaning feels like being seen. A designed world feels safer than a world shaped by blind forces, even when those forces are gentle. To imagine rivers following a lost civilization's map is to imagine that the planet once had a coherent author, a mind behind the scenery, a deliberate intelligence that placed corridors and crossings with reverence. It is a beautiful fantasy. It turns the landscape into inheritance, but the landscape is older than inheritance. The landscape belongs to pressure and chemistry and the long, slow arguments between heat and cold. What appears like deliberate layout is often only the planet minimizing effort, conserving energy, choosing the simplest resolution to an endless problem: how to move water from high to low. And yet, there is a different kind of intelligence here, not the intelligence of planning, the intelligence of emergence. Emergence is the way a flock becomes a shape without a leader. It is the way countless grains become a dune with a spine. It is the way a river network becomes a coherent geometry without anyone drawing it first. It is the way order rises, not like a command, but like a habit. A single droplet cannot know the basin. A single rivulet cannot know the delta. But all droplets obey the same law. All rivulets respond to the same constraints. And out of that shared obedience, a structure appears. Beautiful, recurring, almost mythic. Like a language no one invented. Like a prayer no one authored. Like a lullaby the universe hums to itself. Some rivers appear to follow older lines, and they do, in a way. They follow weaknesses in rock, faults, fractures, joints, places where stone has already admitted vulnerability. A river is drawn to vulnerability the way sleep is drawn to exhaustion. It finds the soft places and deepens them. It inherits ancient wounds and turns them into valleys. In that inheritance, the world begins to look like it is remembering. A channel aligns with a fault line. A tributary follows a buried seam. A river bends where a glacier once pressed, and the pattern becomes layered, present water following past structure, like a voice following an old melody. This is why maps seem to appear in nature, not because someone placed them there, but because the planet has always been writing in palimpsest, new lines traced over old ones, each layer faintly visible beneath the next. Memory here is not a story told aloud. Memory is the shape of what remains after pressure. And as the river grows, it does not merely carry water, it carries evidence. Tiny fragments of mountain, dust from distant slopes, carbon from decaying leaves, salts from ancient seas trapped in stone. The river becomes a moving archive, an unrolling record written in suspended grains. Each grain has been somewhere else. Each grain is a small witness. Downstream, the water slows in a bend, and the witnesses settle. Silt gathers on the inside curve, building a small crescent shore. Sandbars rise like pale backs of sleeping animals. The channel shifts a little, dissatisfied with its own path. The bank collapses somewhere, and the river accepts the collapse as new instruction. No plan, only revision. And in the revision, the river grows more like writing, because writing is revision too. A sentence forms, is reshaped, is softened. An ending becomes a beginning. The line that seemed final becomes only a draft. The river does not hurry. The river does not conclude. The river keeps folding itself into the land, and the land keeps folding the river into time. But what the planet buried, it never truly forgot, and the next part of the current is already turning, slow and inevitable, towards the deeper architecture beneath the surface. Beneath the river's visible skin, beneath the glittering surface that pretends it is the whole story, there is another river, slower, darker, older in temperament. It does not sparkle. It does not announce itself. It moves through pores and fractures, through sediments laid down by vanished climates, through the bruised architecture of stone. This hidden water is not a rumour. It is the planet's quiet circulation, a bloodstream without a heart. In some places it rests for years inside gravel like a held breath. In other places it slides along bedrock, thin as a thought, until it finds a spring and rises again, pale and cold, as if the earth has been speaking in secret and finally decided to whisper aloud. A map drawn by a lost civilization would be visible only for as long as the surface stayed faithful. But the surface is never faithful. The surface is only the most recent layer of forgetting. Because landscapes do not preserve plans. Landscapes preserve tendencies. Water finds fractures because fractures are already halfway to a channel. Water follows faults because faults are already half a valley. What looks like deliberate routing, what looks like careful alignment, like corridors that shouldn't be so straight, like bends that shouldn't recur, is often the planet revealing its internal seams. The river is not obeying a human geometry. The river is obeying the planet's old injuries, and injuries are a kind of memory. Long before a river is wide enough to hold moonlight, the stone beneath it has already been shaped by pressures that never received names. Plates pushed and folded, mountains rose with slow violence, then began the equally slow surrender of being worn down. Heat altered minerals. Cold split rock open, salt expanded and cracked hidden chambers. Earth's crust was written on and rewritten, not once, but endlessly, as if the planet could not stop revising its own face. Then water arrives and reads the revisions, not like an archaeologist with tools and patience, but like a blind hand tracing grooves, because the grooves are there. So the river becomes an interpreter without understanding. In the human imagination, interpretation suggests intent. It suggests a mind behind the act. But there is another kind, an interpretation done by physics, not thought. A river interprets the land the way smoke interprets wind, the way a shadow interprets light, the way sleep interprets sorrow by softening it into dream. The tributaries gather as if they are returning to something. Small streams become larger ones, not out of loyalty, but because flow converges, because the world is shaped like a funnel, because gravity has only one direction to offer. And yet, from far above, the network can still resemble a forgotten design. It resembles the branching of nerves. It resembles the branching of roots. It resembles the branching of lightning across a storm's dark chest. This resemblance is the planet's signature of efficiency, a repeated solution to a repeated problem, how to move something through space with the least cost. The river does not seek to be beautiful. The river seeks to be possible. In that seeking, Beauty appears the way silence appears when noise stops trying to fill every corner. At the edge of a watershed, a raindrop falls onto a ridge so subtle it could be mistaken for a gentle swelling of land. On one side, the drop will eventually become part of one ocean. On the other side, it will eventually become part of another. That ridge is a boundary without a fence, a border drawn without ink, a decision line so quiet that only water truly notices it. Such divides drift over geologic time. A mountain lifts and the divide shifts. A valley deepens and steals headwaters from a neighbouring basin. Rivers can capture other rivers, not with malice, but with advantage. A channel that cuts backward into a ridge can claim the rainfall that once belonged elsewhere. The network reorganizes itself like a sleeping mind rearranging its dreams. No planner could keep up with that. Even human maps are too stiff for such living change. A drawn line becomes obsolete as soon as the river chooses a new preference. And rivers do choose, in the only way they can, through the quiet selection of pathways that spend less energy. This is emergence again, returning like a refrain. A simple rule repeated. A pattern that rises. A structure that feels authored. The ancient temptation returns with it, soft and persistent. The idea that perhaps the rule itself is a kind of intelligence, that perhaps the planet's laws are not cold but sacred, that perhaps lost civilization is a metaphor for something older than people, the deep order that governs matter, the invisible agreements that keep the cosmos from falling apart into meaningless scatter. In that sense, the rivers do follow a map, not a map made of parchment, a map made of constraint. Gravity draws the first line, topography thickens it, substrate edits it, climate revises it, and time, patient, indifferent, endless, presses the whole page until the lines look inevitable. Somewhere downstream, the river begins to meander. It leans into curves the way a tired body leans into rest. A meander is not randomness. It is a slow dance between erosion and deposition. The outside bank is cut, the inside bank is built. The channel migrates sideways over years, over centuries, over spans longer than a single life can hold. In that migration, floodplains are made, wide, flat places that look like invitations, places where soil is deep and soft, where plants grow thick, where animals gather, where humans eventually arrive and decide that this must be where living should happen. Civilizations rise beside rivers not because rivers are convenient decorations, but because rivers are the planet's original corridors. They are the first roads. They are the first lines of movement across wildness. So when the human hand draws maps, it often traces what the water already wrote. The question turns gently, like a slow bend. Perhaps it is not that rivers follow a lost civilization's map. Perhaps civilizations have always followed rivers, like children following the crease of an ancient palm, believing the line is destiny, when it is simply a tendency repeated long enough to seem like fate. And still, the river remains indifferent. It does not pledge loyalty to any city. It does not hold the shape of any bridge in its mind. It does not remember the name spoken on its banks. It carries silt and dissolves stone and keeps moving because the planet's oldest instruction does not ask permission. Move downhill, gather, return. But what the planet buried, it never truly forgot, because the next part of the story drifts even deeper into the quiet evidence, the fossils of old channels, the ash of vanished floods, the way memory becomes sediment and sleeps beneath the river's waking voice. Long before any river becomes an argument on a map, long before any boundary is drawn with ink and defended with voices, water has already been arranging the world in a quieter way, through absence, because erosion is not only the act of removing, It is the act of making room. A canyon is not a thing added to the earth. It is a place the earth agreed to lose. A valley is not built like a wall. It is unbuilt, grain by grain, until the missing becomes a shape, and the shape, once formed, begins to guide everything that comes after it, as if emptiness can be inherited. This is one of the planet's oldest enchantments, that what is gone can become a path. A river learns its route the way smoke learns a chimney. The channel is first a preference, then a habit, then a history. Soon, even when rain falls wildly, without pattern, without care, the water finds the old line again, because the old line is lower, smoother, easier. So the river's memory is carved into the land itself. No mind is required, only repetition. Somewhere beneath that repetition, there are other archives, silent, compacted, and sleeping. Sediment, not merely dirt, not merely mud, but the planet's way of keeping notes. A single grain of sand can be older than a city by a margin too large to feel. It might have been part of a mountain peak. Once, it might have been held inside a granite body when the world was younger, when the air was different, when life had not yet learned to speak in bones. Then time, patient and merciless in its softness, loosened it. Rain carried it. A river took it into motion, and eventually it settled in a bend, in a delta, in a quiet seabed, where it lay down among countless other grains, each one a small witness fallen asleep. Over time those witnesses stack, layer upon layer, thin as paper, heavy as forever. The lower layers are pressed by the weight of the upper. Water between grains is squeezed out. Minerals precipitate, knitting particles together. Sand becomes sandstone. Mud becomes shale. The river's carried thoughts harden into rock, and the rock becomes a page. This is how a landscape remembers without a brain, by turning motion into strata. And in those strata, sometimes, old rivers are preserved, channels filled in, meanders fossilized. Braid patterns locked into stone like frozen handwriting. A river can vanish from the surface and still remain beneath it, a ghost corridor sealed under newer deposits. Later, centuries, millennia, whole climates later, water can return and prefer that same corridor again because it is softer, because it is lower, because the ghost still shapes the present. So the river seems to follow something ancient. It does, but not the blueprint of a lost people. It follows the residue of its own former self. This is the kind of haunting Earth specializes in. Self-haunting. The planet leaving traces for the planet to rediscover. The world becoming its own forgotten civilization, folding its history into rock, then building on top of it until only the pattern remains. In some places, the buried traces are subtle, detectable only by those who listen with instruments, by the way groundwater moves, by the way vegetation grows greener along an invisible seam, by the way the surface subsides ever so slightly where old channels once lay. The land betrays its secrets slowly. In hints, in other places, the traces are loud enough to be seen from far above. Pale scars across deserts, ancient riverbeds etched into dry plains, winding like blueprints abandoned mid-draft. There, the mind feels the old thrill, the sense that a message has been left, but it is not a message, it is a consequence preserved. The river, in its patience, does not only carve, it also abandons. A channel shifts, a bend migrates. A shortcut forms during a flood and becomes the new main route. The old loop is cut off, left behind as an oxbow lake, still water shaped like a question mark, holding a quiet mirror to the sky. In time, even that lake silts in. It becomes a wetland, then a meadow, then perhaps a patch of forest that looks ordinary, until, one night, heavy rain returns and the old channel's ghost becomes useful again. Water finds the low place. Water remembers what the mind forgot. A landscape is a library, written in low places. Every depression is a sentence that once carried flow. Every ridge is a boundary that once redirected it. Every fan-shaped spread of sediment at a mountain's base is a history of floods, each one a brief and violent paragraph, now quiet under grass. And still the longing persists, soft and human, to imagine intelligence behind the pattern. Because intelligence is comforting. Intelligence means someone was awake, someone meant it, someone cared enough to arrange it. In the dark, the desire for an arranger is really the desire not to be alone inside a vast indifferent cosmos. But tonight's story offers a different comfort, one that does not require ancient architects, the comfort of law. Because the universe does not need to be conscious to be consistent. A river network can resemble design because design is often an imitation of what works. Branching is efficient. Convergence is inevitable. Deltas spread because sediment must go somewhere when current slows. The same shapes arise again and again because the same constraints return again and again. This is emergence, whispered through water. A river is not a thought, but it can resemble one. A river is not a sentence written to be read, but it can resemble scripture. And perhaps that resemblance is enough, not as proof of lost civilizations, but as proof that the world, even without intention, can produce forms that feel sacred. Because sacredness is not always a decision. Sometimes it is an effect. Sometimes it is what happens when time repeats a simple act until the act becomes beautiful. But what the planet buried, it never truly forgot, because the next part of the current moves toward the silent borders of basins, the ridgelines where a single drop chooses between destinies, and toward the way rivers steal one another's futures, reshaping the map without ever needing a hand. A valley is a kind of thought the planet keeps having, not the bright kind that arrives and leaves, not the sharp kind that demands attention. A valley is a slow thought, pressed into form, repeated until it becomes a place. It is what happens when time stops being a clock and becomes a weight. Ridges rise like quiet sentences that refuse to be crossed. Hollows gather like open palms. And somewhere between them, water chooses a direction with the innocence of inevitability. The choice is not a choice. It is only the world obeying its own shape. In the long, dim breathing of Earth, nothing truly starts. Everything continues. A raindrop lands in the high country, where the air is thin and the stone is old enough to have forgotten heat. It touches a slope and begins to move, because down is older than language. Because gravity is the planet's constant lullaby, sung beneath all other sounds. It slides into a crease not because the crease was designed, but because the crease is already lower than its neighbours. It meets another drop, then another. And soon the crease becomes a corridor, and the corridor becomes a promise that keeps itself. A watershed is born from that promise. A watershed is not a line on a map. It is a hush in the land, a subtle tilt of reality, where one side of a ridge sends its water toward one destiny, and the other side sends its water toward another. This divide can be so gentle that it feels like nothing underfoot, just a slight lift, a modest swelling of ground. Yet the consequence is immense. A single step can separate two oceans, two climates, two futures carried in liquid. Borders exist without flags. Decisions exist without minds. The valley begins to remember, not by recalling, but by recording. Every time water passes, it takes a little more. The grain loosens, lifted with no ceremony. carried as if it had been waiting for permission to leave. The bed lowers, the banks sharpen, the channel becomes less a suggestion and more an instruction. The next storm arrives and obeys the instruction because it is easier than inventing a new path. So the valley deepens and the memory becomes physical. Memory here is not a story. Memory is a low place that persists. In the dark language of landscapes, the deepest memories are often the quietest. A canyon can shout in daylight, but the more subtle remembering happens in the gentle slopes of a basin, in the faint repeated direction of tiny streams that gather like whispers toward a main voice. A drainage basin is an invisible bowl. It holds the logic of the land, the way a skull holds the logic of a mind. Water falls into it again and again, and because the bowl is shaped, the water behaves as though it has been instructed. This is where the illusion of planning becomes especially strong. From above, a basin can look like a designed system, tributaries arranged like arteries, a main channel like a spine. The mind, hungry for intention, notices the coherence and suspects a hand. But coherence can arise from constraint alone. A basin is not a blueprint. It is a consequence of slope and rock and time. Still, the valley's remembering has another layer, deeper than the surface channel. Stone is not uniform. Stone is a patchwork of pasts. It contains old fractures, faults that once groaned when continents pressed against each other. It contains joints where cooling and contraction made rock split like dry lips. It contains layers laid down in ancient seas, each layer a different softness, a different willingness to yield. Water does not need to know any of this to follow it. Water only needs to find the weakness. So valleys often align with the hidden grammar of geology. They follow ancient fault lines because fault lines are already broken, already softened, already prepared to become corridors. They widen where the bedrock is weaker, narrow where it is stubborn. They bend in response to buried structures the surface cannot see. This is how a valley can resemble an old road, not because a road existed first, but because weakness existed first. A lost civilization's map is a romantic thought. The idea of deliberate lines etched across continents, lines so enduring that even rivers must obey them. But the planet has its own older lines, drawn without intention and held without mercy. Tectonics sketches the first drafts. Uplift raises ridges. Subsidence lowers basins. Glaciers scrape. Volcanoes pour new pages of basalt. And water arriving afterward reads those drafts as if they were instructions. A river does not invent the world. A river reveals it. So the valley becomes a kind of translator, turning hidden structure into visible form. What was once a fault becomes a canyon. What was once a soft sediment layer becomes a wide floodplain. What was once a buried seam becomes a spring-fed corridor of green. Even the living world participates in this translation. Vegetation thickens along wet ground. Roots stabilize banks or loosen them. Fallen trees redirect flow, briefly. Beavers, quiet engineers, slow water into ponds that become new sediment beds, new future meadows. Life and water braid together, shaping the valley's memory in slow collaboration, not by plan, but by persistence. And then there is the most haunting kind of valley memory, the memory of stolen water. A divide is not always stable. A river can grow backward, cutting into a ridge from the low side, slowly, patiently, like a needle working through cloth. This cutting can eventually breach the boundary and capture the headwaters that once belonged to another basin. The stolen water is not taken in anger. It is taken because the new path is lower, because erosion favours advantage, the way sleep favours darkness. A basin can be rearranged without warning. A destiny can be rerouted without consent. This is how landscapes change their minds, without ever having one. The valley, once carved, becomes a bias. It influences every future raindrop, every future storm, every future season. It teaches water where to go. It teaches sediment where to settle. It teaches living things where the richest soils will gather. And eventually, it teaches humans where to build, because humans too are drawn to low places that promise water, soil, passage. So the suspicion returns, softer now, almost tender, that perhaps the valley is not only a feature, but an invitation written in earth. Yet invitation does not require an inviter. A valley can feel like a planned corridor, because corridors are what physics produces when flow repeats. The land, given enough time, becomes the path of least resistance for the things that must move. Water, sediment, animals, stories. And in that sense, valleys remember, not with minds, but with shapes. Not with language, but with slopes. Not with intention, but with the deep patience of constraint. But what the planet buried, it never truly forgot, because beneath every visible valley lies another, older, hidden, compressed, waiting to be reawakened by the next long breath of water. A valley can be born in more than one silence. Sometimes it is water that begins the sentence. Rain gathering into flow, flow gathering into insistence, insistence becoming a cut. Sometimes it is ice, arriving without apology, slow as a continent's sigh, pressing and grinding until the land forgets the sharpness it once had. Sometimes it is the lifting of mountains, the hidden heave of the crust, raising ridges like knuckles beneath skin. And sometimes it is collapsed stone giving up its posture, folding into itself, leaving a hollow for water to inherit. No single author, only many pressures taking turns. A valley that looks clean and inevitable in daylight is often an argument made over ages. Hard rock resists, soft rock yields. Layers behave like moods. Basalt holds firm. Shale gives way. Limestone dissolves with a private kind of surrender, letting water take it not as sand, but as invisibility, vanishing into chemistry, into hidden caverns, into the dark throat of groundwater. So even when a river appears to choose a route, the choice is already weighted. The land has preferences long before the water arrives. The land is not neutral. It has scars. It has weak seams. It has old fractures that still remember the moment they split. This is how lost maps are mistaken into existence. A river runs strangely straight for a long distance, as if following a ruler's edge. A valley aligns with a direction too consistent to feel accidental. Parallel channels repeat across a plain like deliberate strokes. The mind sees the lines and imagines a mind behind them, but straightness can be an echo of brokenness. A fault line is a kind of ancient sentence crack, an old place where the crust slipped, where rock was ground into finer material, where the world once moved violently in slow motion. Along that zone, stone is weakened, crushed, easier to erode. Water arrives later and finds that corridor already half open. So the river does what water always does. It goes where it can. In this way, valleys can appear to be built on purpose when they are built on vulnerability. The planet does not hide its history. It stores it in the places that yield first. And the yielding repeats. A channel deepens. That deepening steepens the slope. That steeper slope increases the river's ability to carry more sediment. The carrying scours the bed lowers further. The valley grows sharper, more convinced. The system reinforces itself. The way of thought becomes a belief by being rehearsed in the dark. This rehearsal is one of Earth's oldest rituals. If the river network is language, then valleys are the grooves left in the mouth of the planet. The places where speech has been said so often, it has shaped the speaker. And still, memory in a valley is not only in what is cut away, it is also in what is left behind. Floodplains are memory laid flat when water rises. Seasonally, cyclically, unpredictably, it spills out of its channel and spreads across the valley floor. In that spreading, the river slows, and slowing makes it let go. Silt settles like soft ash. Fine particles fall in silence. The valley floor is dusted with fertility, layer by layer, until it becomes a quiet archive of floods that came and went without being witnessed by anyone alive today. A flood is not only destruction, a flood is also handwriting. The river writes its history outward in thin blankets of sediment, and the valley keeps it, not as narrative, as texture, as mineral composition, as a faint change in soil colour that tells to those who know how to listen that water once stood here long enough to leave its signature. Then, over centuries, the channel migrates. It leans, it curves, it wanders across its own floodplain like a tired mind drifting across dreams. When the river shifts, it abandons old meanders and creates new ones. The valley becomes a collection of former selves, oxbow scars, subtle swales, crescent-shaped damp spots where the ground still holds water differently, because the past still changes how the present behaves. This is the quietest law of landscapes. The past is structural. A valley does not need to remember, it only needs to keep its shape, and shade influences everything. It influences where fog gathers. It influences where cold air pools at night, heavy and unhurried. It influences where certain plants can survive, where certain insects persist, where certain animals move along the easiest corridors between hills. The valley becomes a path not just for water but for life, because life too follows ease. And then, eventually, humans arrive, doing what humans always do, mistaking ease for invitation and invitation for destiny. Roads follow valleys because valleys already solve the problem of passage. Trade routes follow river corridors because water already carved a gentle grade through rough land. Settlements rise on floodplains because floodplains offer soil that remembers nourishment. Even when cities pretend to be independent of nature, their bones often trace the older geometry beneath them, so the myth returns with a gentler face. Perhaps the lost civilization's map is not something that existed before the rivers, but something that exists because of them. A human habit of building along the lines water teaches. A civilization's grid laid lightly over an older, curving script. Maps imitate rivers. Rivers do not imitate maps, but there is still another kind of valley memory, one that behaves like theft, like a quiet reshuffling of fate. Some rivers grow upstream, not by reversing flow, but by eroding their channels backward, cutting into the headwaters region, like a slow animal gnawing through a ridge. This backward cutting can eventually breach a divide. When it does, the river captures water that once fed a neighbouring basin. The stolen tributaries swing allegiance without ceremony, and the valley's future changes. A watershed boundary can migrate. An ocean can lose a raindrop it once expected. No voice announces this, no bell rings. Yet over long spans, such captures redraw entire drainage networks. Valleys that seem permanent are revealed as negotiable. The map changes while no one is looking. This is why the land can feel haunted, not by spirits, but by revisions too slow to witness. And beneath all these revisions, the core idea keeps breathing: emergence. A valley system becomes coherent without a planner, because physics rewards coherence, because water organizes itself around least resistance, because erosion amplifies small differences until they become large, because time gives every small bias the chance to become destiny. Time doesn't pass, it settles. In the settling, the valley's memory grows deeper, not as knowledge, but as groove, not as thought, but as form. And form, once made, guides everything that comes after, as if the planet is always whispering the same instruction to itself. This way again, this way until it feels like it was always meant. But what the planet buried it never truly forgot, because the next part drifts toward the hidden rivers inside rock, the groundwater corridors and ancient buried channels that make the surface seem guided by an invisible hand. Under the visible valley, under grass and gravel and the patient scab of soil, there is a second geography made of darkness and delay. Water moves there without sunlight, without reflections, without the theatre of ripples. It moves like a secret that never hurries, because it has nowhere urgent to be. It moves through pores so small they could be mistaken for stillness. It moves along fractures in bedrock that opened long before any creature learnt to measure time. It moves through sand bodies buried, like old sleep beneath newer ground. This unseen movement is not a footnote to the river, it is part of the river's body. It is the part that teaches the surface where to stay wet in drought, where springs will speak, where a valley will remain green even when the sky forgets to rain. A valley remembers because it has an inside. The surface channel is the loudest sentence, the one that can be heard, but the subsurface is the murmured draft, edited in silence, carried slowly, stored and released with a patience that feels almost sacred. In that patience, the landscape begins to resemble intelligence, not because it thinks, but because it regulates, it holds, it releases, it balances its own thirst. This is where the idea of a hidden map becomes most seductive, because hidden water can make the surface behave strangely. A river can appear to choose a path that does not match what the eye expects, because the eye only sees the skin of the world. Beneath that skin, there may be an ancient channel filled with permeable sand, a buried corridor that pulls water the way a long-forgotten memory pulls the mind in sleep. There may be a fault zone that conducts groundwater, a quiet artery inside rock. There may be a dissolved limestone maze, karst, where water travels in caverns and reappears elsewhere, as if it has slipped through the world like a whispered shortcut. To a mind looking for intention, these behaviors feel planned. To the planet, they are simply preference-obeying structure. A valley can hold an aquifer, the way a skull holds a dream. Rain falls in the uplands, infiltrates the soil, and slowly becomes part of a hidden reservoir. Then, long after the storm is gone, long after the sky has moved on and the surface has dried, that stored water continues to feed springs and seep into streams. The river persists not because the day is generous, but because the valley has learned how to keep what it receives. Time does not pass, it percolates. In this slower time, the land seems to have memory because it does. Stored water is memory made liquid. It is yesterday's rain arriving late, softened by darkness. It is the past returning, drop by drop, to keep the present from becoming brittle. And in that return, the valley deepens its own bias, because groundwater shapes rock too. Water dissolves minerals silently. It widens cracks without noise. It undermines slopes until a collapse happens years later and looks sudden, even though it was prepared for a long time. A sinkhole is not a surprise. It is a long sentence that finally reaches its period. So the valley's form is sculpted from two directions at once, from above by flowing rivers and from within by hidden water, dissolving, weakening, rearranging. The landscape becomes a layered memory of processes that are not visible in the moment they occur. This layering is the planet's favourite way of making things look like fate. And still, the basin, the great bowl that gathers tributaries, holds another kind of quiet logic. Each tributary is a small negotiation with slope and substrate. Each one is a minor answer to the same ancient question: which way is easiest? Where rock is fractured, tributaries multiply. Where soil is thin, runoff is quicker. Where vegetation is thick, water pauses and sinks. Where the land is steep, channels cut deep and narrow. Where the land is gentle, channels wander, and their wandering writes wide floodplains like soft pages. All of this feels like a system, because it is a system, not designed, emerged. The planet's system is built from constraints, and constraints produce geometry the way music produces rhythm. The repeated shape of branching appears again, small streams joining into larger ones, like sentences joining into paragraphs, like paragraphs joining into a book that no one finishes reading. The human mind meeting this shape often feels two emotions at once: awe and ache. Awe, because the world is coherent enough to look meaningful. Because coherence without intention can feel lonely, like hearing a lullaby sung by a machine, beautiful and yet indifferent to who is listening. So the imagination offers a softer explanation: a lost civilization, an ancient planner, a vanished hand that once traced lines across the land with reverence, leaving behind a network so persuasive that even water still follows it. But the valley does not need a vanished hand to be persuasive. The valley persuades by being lower, by being easier, by being inevitable once made. And once made, it becomes a guide not only for water, but for everything that moves. Animals follow valleys because valleys offer passage. Seeds travel along valleys because wind and water funnel them. Mist gathers in valleys because cold air sinks. Sound travels differently through valleys, held and carried. Even human stories, myths, trade routes, pilgrimages, slide naturally into these corridors because the body prefers not to climb when it does not have to. So the valley becomes a kind of stage for civilization, even while remaining indifferent to it. This indifference is not cruelty, it is scale. A valley's timescale is too long to care about the short bloom of cities. It receives them the way it receives floods and droughts, as episodes, as brief weather in a much longer climate. A city can rise beside a river and believe it has chosen its home wisely. The river, patient, may agree for a while. Then the channel shifts, the floodplain reasserts itself. The water takes back a street in a single night of heavy rain. Not as revenge, as function, as the valley remembering what it was built to do. The sea doesn't remember. It reclaims in rivers. Rivers rearrange. The valley's deepest remembering is not nostalgia, it is persistence. It persists as a low place. It persists as a bias. It persists as a corridor that keeps inviting flow, even when the surface tries to pretend the invitation has been revoked. And beneath everything, the hidden map continues. Faults, folds, buried channels, ancient sediment bodies, structures formed by older forces than any mind. These structures guide water with an authority that can look like intention from above, the way the rings of a tree can look like deliberate art until the long years are imagined, stacked quietly inside wood. So the valley, remembering without brains, becomes the perfect illusion, a system that behaves like design, created by law and patience alone. But what the planet buried, it never truly forgot, because the next part of the story drifts toward the oldest memories of all. Valleys shaped by ice, by vanished climates, by epochs that left their fingerprints in the geometry of drainage like forgotten languages, carved into stone. Branching is the universe learning how to speak without a mouth. It appears in places that never agreed to be related, in the pale lightning that splits a storm's dark torso, in the veins of leaves carrying sunlight's finished work into every living corner, in the lungs of animals where air must become intimate with blood, in coral's slow architecture, in the cracks of drying mud, in the way streets sometimes grow outward from an old market like roots searching for water, and in rivers, always in rivers, branching arrives with the quiet confidence of something that does not need permission. A single stream begins as a thin insistence, and then the world repeats itself. Another stream forms nearby, another crease accepts rain, another hollow becomes a corridor. The small lines reach, then merge. Tributaries gather like shy voices joining a choir. The main channel thickens, not as a king crowned by decree, but as a centre formed by inevitability. The shape looks like organisation. The shape feels like meaning. So the mind leans in and imagines language. Not the quick language of speech, bright, human, full of interruption, but the long language of matter, patient, recursive, written in gradients revised by storms. In this chapter, the rivers are not only water, they are syntax. A tributary is a syllable, a confluence is punctuation, a watershed is a paragraph boundary drawn with no ink, a delta is an ending that refuses to be final, spreading itself into many smaller endings until the sea takes the whole sentence and dissolves it. And yet the river does not mean to communicate. It does not say, "Here is my plan," it does not say, "Here is my purpose." It does not say anything at all. But the pattern still speaks, because patterns are a kind of voice even when no one is speaking. They are the footprint of constraints. They are what remains when a simple rule is repeated long enough to carve elegance into a world that began without elegance in mind. A river network is a diagram of least resistance. That phrase, if spoken too sharply, would feel like a classroom. Tonight, it must be carried like a feather. Least resistance is not a concept, it is a mood. Water prefers the gentlest path the way sleep prefers darkness. It avoids sharpness when it can. It chooses smoothness when smoothness is available. It is not lazy. It is faithful to the cheapest expenditure of energy, to the quiet economy written into physics. So branching appears because flow must spread to gather. Rain falls across a wide surface, scattered as doubt. Then gravity collects it into fewer and fewer roots. Like many small thoughts narrowing into a single dream, the landscape offers countless micropaths, tiny depressions, soft soils, cracks in stone, and water samples them all, not with curiosity, but with repetition. The paths that are easiest are used more often. Used more often, they deepen. Deepened, they become easier still. And the loop closes, self-strengthening, self-teaching. A lesson without a teacher. This is emergence, though the word does not need to be announced. Emergence is the way the world becomes more than its parts. A droplet is not a river. A stream is not a basin. A basin is not a continent's drainage web. And yet, given enough time, the droplet participates in the river the way a single breath participates in a life. The branching network looks intentional because it is coherent. Coherence is what happens when a system repeats itself under consistent laws. The laws are not kind, they are not cruel. They are simply steady. They do not care whether the result resembles art. They do not care whether the result resembles a map. But the result can resemble both. And here, in the dim corridor of sleep, the haunting question returns in a new shape. If rivers are not following a lost civilization's map, then why does the network feel like a script someone could read? because the script is not addressed to anyone. It is addressed to the planet itself. The branching pattern is the Earth solving for movement, transporting water, transporting sediment, transporting dissolved minerals, transporting the quiet chemistry of mountains towards the open mouth of the sea. Branching is the most efficient way to collect distributed input and funnel it into a few main lines. The same logic appears wherever something must be gathered and delivered: blood in veins, sap in trees, data in networks, water in rivers. The universe repeats what works, not by choice, by consequence. So in the river's branching, there is a kind of blind intelligence, an intelligence that does not imagine, does not plan, does not dream, and yet produces shapes that can induce dreaming in those who witness them. The heart wants an author because authorship feels personal, feels like being intended. It feels like not being alone in a world too large to hold. So the myth of a lost civilization's map is not only about ancient people, it is about yearning. The yearning to believe that beauty is evidence of care, but beauty can also be evidence of constraint. A river does not carve randomly, it carves preferentially. It follows slopes and weaknesses, and as it follows them, it amplifies them. The network becomes a hierarchy of channels, each one fed by smaller ones, each one feeding into something larger, like a sentence fed by words, like a poem fed by breath. And breath matters here, because the rhythm of the river network is not only spatial, it is temporal. Rain comes in pulses, seasons arrive and withdraw. Floods surge, then fade. Dry spells hush the channels until only a thin thread remains, murmuring against stone. The river's language is not a single continuous sound. It is phrased. It pauses. It returns. Long poetic sentences, broken by short, breath-like phrases. Time doesn't pass. It braids. The network on the surface is braided with the network in the sky. Storms, atmospheric rivers, moving bands of moisture that travel vast distances before letting go. It is braided with the network underground. Seepage in springs and slow-moving aquifers that feed streams long after clouds have moved on. It is braided with the network in living bodies. Forests that release water back into air, soils that hold moisture like memory, roots that change infiltration, changing the very birth of tributaries. So the river network is not only a map of water, it is a map of relationships, not social relationships, not spoken ones, but the relationships between slope and rock, between rain and root, between temperature and evaporation, between the visible world and the hidden one. The network is what those relationships look like when they are given a continent and enough time. If a lost civilization ever existed, its roads would have cracked, its walls would have fallen, its names would have turned to dust. But the planet's relationships persist. They persist because they are not structures made of stone blocks. They are structures made of law, and law is harder to erode than marble. The river network feels like language, because language is also a system of constraints. Grammar is not a decoration. Grammar is a way of minimizing confusion, of making flow easier. A sentence is the path of least resistance for meaning, just as a channel is the path of least resistance for water. Both are shaped by what works, and both become beautiful when repeated across long spans. But what the planet buried, it never truly forgot, and in the next part, the branching will deepen into its most haunting mirror, the way rivers, trees, lungs, lightning, and galaxies share a family resemblance, as if the universe keeps drawing the same shape in different materials. Branching is not a style, branching is a consequence. It is what happens when something must travel through space, when it begins in many places at once, when it must gather, when it must arrive somewhere else without wasting itself along the way. Branching is how the universe avoids exhaustion. It is the geometry of saving energy without knowing the word save. A cloud does not rain in a single point. It loosens itself across a wide skin of air. A storm is generous in its scatter. It drops water into countless small beginnings, onto needles of pine, onto bare rock, onto city roofs that hold it briefly like a secret, onto soil that accepts it with dark patience. So the world begins with many. Then gravity asks for one. Not one drop, not one stream, but fewer pathways than the rain began with, because convergence is what happens when down is shared and the land is shaped like a bowl. So tributaries form like quiet decisions made on behalf of everything. A small rivulet becomes the preferred route for a patch of hillside. Nearby, another rivulet does the same. Their little territories touch. Their flows meet, their separate histories become one history, and the meeting leaves behind a scar of change, a deeper channel, a softer bank, a new line that will be easier to follow next time. In this way, the network grows not by invention, but by rehearsal. What is rehearsed becomes real. At first, the branching is delicate, almost shy. It hides in shallow grooves that vanish under grass. It hides in the way wet soil darkens in thin streaks after rain. It hides in the way small stones are rearranged so subtly that only a careful eye would notice the difference between before and after. But time is careful. Time watches every repetition and rewards it with permanence. A little channel deepens. A new tributary gains confidence. A faint hollow becomes a defined path. And slowly the basin begins to resemble a written thing, an emblem, a sigil, a secret script pressed into the continent. It is easy then to believe in an ancient hand. It is easy to imagine that somewhere in deep history, a civilization stood above these landscapes and drew lines that still hold, that perhaps the rivers are obedient to design, that perhaps waterways are the fossil imprint of an intelligence that once guided the planet, like a parent guiding a child. But the network does not need a past culture to be coherent. Coherence is what emerges when constraints are consistent. Gravity does not change its mind. Water remains water. The cheapest route remains cheaper. The same physics repeats itself across valleys, across continents, across worlds. So the pattern repeats too. In another place far away, the same branching appears again. The tributaries look like relatives, even though they have never met. The basins share a family resemblance, even though they were carved in different rocks under different skies and different climates with different histories of ice and heat. This resemblance is not ancestry. It is law. A river network, then, becomes a kind of mirror held up to the universe's habits. It reflects the same truth seen in other systems, systems that seem unrelated until the quiet shape repeats and reveals a hidden kinship. A tree does not resemble a river because it learned from water. A tree resembles a river because both are solving a similar problem: distribution and collection. The tree must deliver water and sugars through its body. The river must deliver water and sediment through the land. Both become branching, because branching is efficient. A lung resembles a river, because the lung must bring air to blood across a vast internal surface. The river must bring water to the sea across a vast external surface. Both become branching because branching increases contact while minimizing distance. Lightning resembles a river because electricity too searches for pathways of least resistance. It branches across the sky like a frantic cousin of water, only faster, only brighter, only more dramatic for a moment, then gone, leaving the quiet world to resume its slower language. And And somewhere beyond this planet, in a scale too large to hold in waking thought, branching appears again in the distribution of matter itself, in filaments and clusters, in a cosmic architecture where gravity gathers what began scattered. There are patterns in the universe that resemble river basins, not because rivers are cosmic, but because gravity is consistent, and consistency breeds resemblance. So the rivers are not copying a lost civilization's map. They are participating in a universal grammar. This is why the network feels like language. Not because it has a message, but because it has rules. Not because it is addressed, but because it is structured. Grammar is not meaning. Grammar is the shape meaning takes when it wants to flow without getting stuck. The river's grammar is written in slope, substrate, and time. Slope is urgency. Steeper land gives water more power, more speed, more ability to cut and carry. Gentler land invites wandering, invites meanders, invites the river to loosen its grip and spread itself thin across a floodplain. Substrate is temperament. Hard rock makes narrow gorges. Soft sediment makes wide valleys. Fractured stone invites straight corridors. Layered stone invites terraces and steps. Time is the editor. Time decides which tiny channels become permanent, which become forgotten, which will be revived by a future storm, and which will be erased by a landslide and rewritten elsewhere. And through all of it, the river does something that feels almost like artistry. It minimizes. It reduces its own effort, not because it is lazy, because it is bound. Energy wants to fall. Water wants to descend. Systems want to find stable arrangements. In that wanting blind, physical, unromantic, elegance is born. A network forms where every tributary is like a smaller branch feeding a larger branch, each one adding flow, each one adding a piece of the basin's collected past. The main channel becomes the final sentence of the watershed, carrying everything the smaller lines gathered: sand and clay, dissolved stone, carbon from forests, tiny fragments of bone and leaf. The river is not only moving water, it is moving the continent. Grain by grain, mountain becomes sediment. Sediment becomes delta. Delta becomes a new edge of land. Land becomes ocean floor. Ocean floor becomes something else, eventually folded and pressed and turned back toward heat. Silence lives inside that cycle. Subduction is the planet's deepest hush. Entire seafloors are taken back into the mantle, their sediments pressed into darkness, their histories erased in heat. Yet even erasure is not complete. Matter returns in new forms. Volcanoes exhale minerals that once lay at the bottom of forgotten seas. Mountains rise from collisions that began far away, long ago. So the river's grammar is not only about branching, it is about return. Nothing ends where it seems to end. Everything continues in a slower register. A delta spreads into the sea like a sentence that cannot stop speaking. The ocean receives the words without keeping them intact. The ocean stirs them, dissolves them, reclaims them. The river's careful script becomes a haze of particles in salt water, and the line that seems so meaningful on land becomes part of a larger silence. This is not tragedy. It is scale. And in scale, the longing for lost maps begins to soften. The idea of an ancient civilization guiding rivers feels less necessary when the universe itself offers a deeper guidance. Constraint, repetition, emergence, a sacredness without a planner, a beauty without a builder. But what the planet buried, it never truly forgot, and the next part will drift closer to the most intimate version of this grammar, the confluence, where two separate waters become one voice and the world changes its meaning without ever speaking a word. A confluence is where two separate silences decide to share one body. Upstream, each tributary has carried its own private history. One has run through pine shadow and granite, tasting cold minerals and thin soils. Another has wandered through softer ground, gathering the brown sweetness of leaves, holding the faint rot of forests the way a long breath holds smoke. Each has taken what the land offered. Each has been shaped by the land's willingness to yield. Then the two arrive at the same low place. No ceremony, no trumpet, only a widening of sound. Water meets water, and the meeting is not a collision, it is an agreement. The two flows braid for a moment, currents crossing, folding, tasting each other's temperature, until they settle into one shared direction. In that settling, the world changes, not dramatically, not loudly, but permanently, in the way a sentence changes once a new clause has been added. A confluence is punctuation. It turns separate phrases into a single thought, and like punctuation, it is invisible to the one who speaks it. The river does not know it has become something new. It only continues downhill, carrying now a larger weight of memory, more sediment, more dissolved stone, more carbon, more of the basin's quiet evidence. This is the strange intimacy of river networks. Each small stream is a separate origin, and yet all origins are temporary. All tributaries are destined to be absorbed, to be rewritten into something larger, to lose their names even if humans insist on naming them. Naming is a human tenderness. A river does not keep its own name. A river keeps its own shape, until time edits it. A river keeps its own direction, until the land changes its mind. The identity of a river, like the identity of anything that moves, is always dissolving into what comes next. So the network is not merely branching, it is merging. And merging is a kind of forgetting. Each tributary brings a story, but at the confluence, the stories cannot remain separate. They mix, they dilute, they become part of a larger voice. What was distinct becomes shared, what was local becomes basin-wide. Memory is not lost, it is blended. In this blending, the old question, soft as fog, returns again, because confluences can resemble engineered junctions. They can look like planned intersections in a city. Two lines meet at angles that seem deliberate. A main stem continues like a boulevard. Smaller streams arrive like side streets. It is tempting to imagine a designer. But design is often an imitation of flow. Civilizations build networks, roads, canals, pipelines, internet cables, because networks are how resources move efficiently. And networks look like rivers, because rivers are the oldest resource network on land. The resemblance is not proof of ancient planning beneath the water. It is proof that both water and humans are constrained by the same need to move something through space while spending as little as possible. Efficiency is a shared hunger, but in rivers, efficiency is not ambition. It is obedience. The branch pattern emerges because the basin must gather what the sky scatters. The merge pattern emerges because the land offers fewer low corridors than there are raindrops. The whole network, branching and merging together, is a continent's answer to rainfall, a way of turning countless tiny arrivals into one long departure toward the sea. The sea doesn't remember, it reclaims. So rivers must keep moving, because their end is not an archive, their end is dissolution. Their end is salt water that will stir their sediments into wider silences, spread their minerals into the body of the ocean, and erase the clean line that once looked like writing. And still, before that erasure, the river's language becomes more elaborate, the channel grows wider, the banks grow taller, the floodplain grows more confident. Meanders appear more frequently, not as decoration, but as the natural result of water negotiating with its own speed. When a river flows fast enough, it can cut. When it flows slow enough, it can drop what it carried. The alternation between cutting and dropping becomes rhythm. That rhythm becomes curvature. A bend is not an accident. A bend is the river exploring ease sideways, not just downhill. The outside of the bend is a hungry edge. Water accelerates there, scouring the bank, pulling soil away as if gently unthreading cloth. The inside of the bend is a place of rest. Water slows there, and what it carries begins to settle, grain by grain, building a bar of sediment like a quiet shoreline that did not exist last season or last decade. Erosion on one side, deposition on the other. The river becomes a moving negotiation between loss and accumulation, between forgetting and memory. It forgets the bank by taking it. It remembers the bank by laying it down elsewhere. The floodplain becomes a rearranged archive of everything the river has touched and carried away. This is how time is written in landscapes, not as a line, but as a shifting, not as a conclusion, but as a migration. A river can migrate so slowly that it feels like permanence, and yet, over centuries, the channel may move across its valley floor by widths that would astonish a mind that believes the present is stable. Old meanders become ghost scars. Former channels become low swales that hold mist in the morning. The land is full of these half-erased sentences, phrases the river once spoke, now softened into silence. And the branching network seen from above includes these ghosts. Not only the current flow, but the memory of former flows. Abandoned loops, pale swaths of wetter soil, subtle vegetation patterns that reveal buried channels like ink bleeding through paper. So the language of rivers is not a single text, it is a palimpsest, a manuscript written, scraped away, written again. If a lost civilization ever etched a map into the world, the river would treat it the way the river treats everything else, as material, as a surface to be revised, as something that will eventually be carried away in grains. The river does not preserve, it translates. It translates height into motion, motion into sediment, sediment into new land into future loss. So the haunting beauty is not in imagining that rivers follow an ancient plan. The beauty is in realizing that the planet can produce plan-like elegance without a planner, through recurrence, through constraint, through the steady grammar of physics that does not need to be conscious to be sacred. Time doesn't pass. It joins. Tributaries join. Stories join. Sediments join. And eventually, the river joins the sea, where all joining becomes dissolving, where every sentence softens into salt. But what the planet buried, it never truly forgot. And the next part will drift toward the most delicate punctuation of all, the divide, the quiet ridgeline where a single drop chooses between two destinies as if the world itself is deciding which story to tell. There are places where the river passes like a thought passing through a sleeping mind, leaving no lasting face, no carved name, no monument that can argue with the sky. And there are places where the river slows, where it lingers long enough to lay its weight down, where it spreads its silt like a blanket, and the land becomes soft with invitation. In those softened places, stone begins to dream of walls, not because the river asks for them, not because the water desires company, but because life, always listening for ease, learns to follow the same old rule the river follows. Find the low place. Find the fertile place. Find the passage that costs less. A floodplain is not a gift. It is a memory of overflow made flat. It is the river confessing, again and again, that it will not stay inside its lines forever. The channel is only a temporary agreement, and the valley knows it. The valley keeps room for the river's larger moods, the sudden widening, the slow spreading, the dark season when the water rises and behaves as though the whole basin belongs to it. Silt arrives in that rising, fine particles that once clung to distant hillsides, minerals loosen from mountains that no longer remember being tall, ash from far-off fires, ground small enough to travel like dust and settle like silence. Each flood lays another thin layer, and over long spans that layering becomes a quiet richness, soil deep enough to hold roots, to hold grain, to hold the fragile insistence of agriculture. This is why the first cities so often appeared beside rivers, not because humans were wise, because humans were drawn. A river is the planet's oldest corridor. It cuts through wildness the way a sentence cuts through confusion. It offers a path where the land would otherwise demand climbing. It offers fresh water where thirst would otherwise speak more loudly than thought. It offers fish, reeds, clay, passage trade, an entire vocabulary of survival, written in flow. So walls rise near water, and humans begin to believe the river belongs to them. The belief is understandable. It is also temporary. A river does not belong. A river moves through. A river rearranges its own face when the season turns, when sediment shifts, when a bank collapses, when a flood finds a shortcut and decides it prefers it. The river is not a neighbour who keeps promises. The river is an ancient function that does not recognise contracts. And still, along the banks, lights appear. Fires, then lamps, then the steady electric hum of streets that pretend to outshine the stars. The river reflects those lights for a while, as if indulging the idea that humans can place permanence beside something that never stops revising. But permanence beside a river is always a kind of prayer, because every floodplain is an archive of the river's refusal to stay fixed. The river has wandered here before. It has spread here before. It has claimed this ground in other centuries, under other skies, when no one was watching. Time doesn't pass. It returns, so the city becomes a brief annotation on the river's longer manuscript. Buildings rise as if they are statements. Bridges stretch as if they are commandments. Levees are built as if they are arguments, and for a while those arguments hold until they do not, because the river's language is older than architecture. It speaks in discharge, in sediment load, in the quiet arithmetic of slope and volume. It speaks in the widening of bends, in the sharpening of banks, in the slow migration of channels across floodplain floors. It speaks in the kind of patience that can wait decades to reclaim a street. A city might look at a river and see a boundary, a decoration, a resource, a line to be managed. The river looks at the city and sees texture. Weight, an obstacle to be flowed around, flowed through, or waited out. And sometimes the river does not even need to rise to change a city's fate. Sometimes it only needs to shift. A channel migrates laterally, one quiet bite at a time, taking soil from one bank and laying it down on the other. The migration is subtle enough to ignore until it isn't. The foundation begins to lean. A road cracks at the edge. A tree that once stood safely inland is suddenly close enough to hear water at night. The river does not hurry. The river does not announce. It simply continues revising the valley, the way wind continues revising dunes, the way glaciers once revised whole continents, the way gravity revises mountains into plains without ever raising its voice. This is where the idea of cities the water never built, because many cities feel inevitable in hindsight, as though they were meant to be where they are, as though geography itself chose them, as though the river's presence was an endorsement, a blessing, a signature of destiny. But the river is not endorsing. The river is simply passing through the easiest corridor, Civilizations cluster along rivers because rivers already solve the hard problem of movement and nourishment. Humans arrive afterward and build stories of intention around that ease. The city becomes convinced it was chosen when it was simply drawn to the same low places everything else is drawn to. So the haunting question changes shape again. If rivers are the planet's original corridors, then is the lost map not under the river, but inside the human habit of following it? A map can be read as a plan. A river can be read as a plan. But neither requires a planner. Sometimes a plan is only a pattern that worked. And still, the human heart wants ancient authors. It wants to believe that beneath the visible world, there is a hidden intelligence that once understood the continent better than anyone living now. It wants to believe that the river's branching is not only physics, but inheritance. That longing is not foolish. It is grief wearing a beautiful mask. The grief of knowing that everything built beside water is temporary, that stone and story and empire eventually soften into sediment, that even names dissolve. Extinction is not always a sudden end. Sometimes it is a slow quieting. A city can disappear without flames. It can be abandoned when the river shifts away, leaving wells dry and harbours stranded. It can be buried when silt rises and channels change. It can be swallowed by vegetation as the floodplain reclaims its softness. It can be drowned when the sea comes inland, taking the river's mouth with it and rewriting the coastline. And later, centuries later, someone can stand on that ground and feel the eerie coherence of the landscape. Feel the way the river still curves as if it remembers streets that are no longer there. But the river is not remembering streets. The river is remembering slope. The river is remembering where the land is willing to yield. The river is remembering old low places, old channels, old corridors carved by older floods. The resemblance to design is the resonance between human construction and the planet's deeper geometry, because humans build beside rivers the way moss grows in shade, following conditions, not commands. And in that quiet truth, something softer than mystery begins to rise, something that can lull the mind rather than sharpen it. A recognition that the world does not need hidden architects to be profound. A recognition that water can create meaning-like patterns simply by obeying gravity long enough. But what the planet buried, it never truly forgot, and the next part will drift deeper into the tenderness of this relationship. The way human roads, borders, and stories mimic waterways, and the way rivers, without malice, under the illusion of ownership again and again. A city can be imagined as a decision made permanent, stones stacked into certainty, streets laid like vows, names pressed into signposts as if naming could hold the world still. For a while, it works. For a while, the river behaves as though it agrees, flowing neatly between banks, reflecting towers and bridges with the calm patience of something that has learned to tolerate brief theatre. But the river's patience is not consent. The river does not sign the city's papers. The river does not attend ceremonies. The river does not recognize property lines drawn by hands that tremble with short lifetimes. The river recognizes only what it has always recognized: slope, volume, sediment, and the silent mathematics of least resistance. So the city builds its confidence on a floodplain, and the floodplain keeps its own memory. A floodplain does not forget that it is a floodplain, even when it is paved, even when it is levelled and planted with manicured trees, even when foundations bite into it and steel rises like a rebuttal. The ground remains what the river made, a place designed by water for water's overflow. The soil is not merely dirt, it is an archive of past widenings, thin layers of silt and sand laid down during high water. Each layer a quiet reminder that the channel is not the river's full body, only its usual posture. High water is the river standing up. And when the river stands, the city often becomes small again, not in importance but in scale. Walls and levees may delay the inevitable for a season, for a generation, for a century. But delaying is not changing. Water waits the way time waits, without impatience, without fatigue. A levee is an argument made of earth. Sometimes the argument holds, sometimes it merely relocates the river's answer, because water does not stop seeking the easiest route. If a barrier makes one route expensive, the river begins to lean into another. It presses against weak seams. It worries at old cracks. It rises until a single failure point becomes a new mouth. Then the floodplain remembers, not dramatically, not as spectacle, as function, as the valley doing what it was always shaped to do. In the aftermath, people speak in the language of surprise. They say the river attacked, the river took, the river destroyed, that the river has no anger, it has no target. It is only motion and consequence. It spreads because it must. It enters streets because streets were placed in the low places the river already owned in its older seasons. Ownership is a brief human spell. Water is older than spells. So the city begins to understand, slowly, reluctantly, that it was never built by the river, only built beside it. That the river did not choose the city chose the river, and then pretended the choice was mutual. This pretense is ancient. The first settlements along rivers likely believed the same quiet fantasy, that living beside water meant being blessed, that the river's presence was an endorsement, that fertility was a promise, and for a while it would have felt true. Fields thick with grain, fish pulled from currents, trade moving along the river's corridor like blood through a living body. Then the river shifted, then the river widened, then the river changed its mind. A channel can migrate away from a harbour and leave it stranded like a mouth that can no longer drink. A delta can build outward and force boats into new routes. Sediment can clog an intake. A flood can bury a street under silt, turning architecture into a shallow reef of stone. And sometimes the opposite happens. The river abandons. A river that once ran beside a city may gradually move elsewhere, leaving behind a dry channel, a quiet trench, a corridor of dust. Wells begin to taste like absence, crops fail, the old lifeline becomes a memory, and the city's certainty begins to crumble, not in a single catastrophe, but in slow attrition. Extinction here is not a scream, it is a thinning of water, a thinning of trade, a thinning of people. Eventually the city becomes a ruin. Then it becomes a mound. Then it becomes soil again because the floodplain is patient, and the wind is patient, and plants are patient, and time is patient. Walls are eaten by root and rain. Bricks soften into clay. Names dissolve until only pattern remains. The faint geometry of foundations visible as subtle rises, subtle dips, the way buried stone makes grass grow differently. And overhead the river continues, indifferent, whispering its own older language. This is why the idea of lost civilizations clings so tightly to river valleys, because rivers are where humans most often built, and rivers are also where the earth most often erases, through floods, through channel migration, through sedimentation, through the slow rearrangement of the land's low places. So when a river valley holds an eerie coherence, when its curves feel too elegant, when its junctions feel too deliberate, the imagination reaches for what it knows: design, planning, the leftover trace of a mind. Yet the deeper truth is simpler. Rivers create the conditions that invite civilization. Then rivers continue doing what rivers do, long after civilization believes itself permanent. The result is a landscape full of half-buried stories, unwritten endings pressed into mud and forgotten under reeds. And so the lost map can be reimagined, not as a chart drafted by vanished hands, but as a mirror. Civilizations mapped themselves onto rivers. Civilizations learned the river's corridors and copied them into roads, borders, and trade lines. Civilizations drew their own networks in imitation of the river's network because the river's network already worked. And later, when the river's network remains and the human network fades, it becomes tempting to believe the river is the follower, but it was always the leader. It is a quiet reversal, and it carries a strange mercy, because it means the planet does not need human intention to be meaningful. The meaning was always in the relationship, water shaping the conditions, life responding, stories rising and dissolving, patterns persisting long after names are gone. A river valley is a theatre of impermanence, a stage built of silt, a script written in flow. And in that theatre, the most haunting role is played by time, the slow actor who never leaves the stage, who changes costumes so gradually that the audience mistakes the change for stillness. Time doesn't pass, it rearranges. The city builds, the river revises, the floodplain remembers. The ruins sink, the names dissolve, the channel shifts again and again until the land looks clean, natural, untouched, except for the faint, persistent sense that something once stood here and that the river has been carrying its dust ever since. But what the planet buried, it never truly forgot, because the next part moves toward the human habit of drawing straight lines across curving worlds, and the way rivers, without effort, teach those lines to soften back into bends. The straight line is one of humanity's most fragile dreams. It is drawn with confidence across paper, across parchment, across screens. Thin, unwavering, certain. It suggests control. It suggests a mind that can look at the world from above and decide where things should go, then make them go there. It suggests that distance can be tamed by geometry, that the planet does not live in straight lines. The planet lives in gradients, in soft tilts, in the slow persuasion of low places. The planet lives in curves because curves are what happen when movement is continuous and resistance is uneven. A river does not bend because it is decorative. It bends because the world is never perfectly uniform, and flow is always negotiating. So when roads are laid beside rivers, they often begin with imitation, following the valley's gentle grade, shadowing the channel's path, borrowing the corridor the water already carved. And then, at some point, the human mind insists on correction. The road is straightened. The channel is pinned. The curve is treated like an error that can be edited out. A line is drawn through a living landscape as though the landscape is only background. For a while the line holds. For a while the river is persuaded, by concrete, by stone, by steel, to behave like a diagram. Banks are armoured. Meanders are cut off. The channel is forced into a narrow throat where it can be measured, managed, predicted. The city exhales, believing it has taught water discipline. But water does not learn discipline. Water learns opportunity. Confinement increases speed. Speed increases power. Power increases the river's ability to cut and carry. So the river, squeezed into straighter walls, often becomes more restless. It scours its bed deeper. It erodes where the armour is imperfect. It searches for escape the way breath searches for an open mouth. Then a storm arrives, or a season shifts, and the river rises, not maliciously, not vengefully, but as an old function returning to its fuller body. The confined channel cannot hold the volume. The water spills, finding the lowest places, and the lowest places are often where the city built its straight lines. The river does not break the rules. It reveals them. A flood is gravity reminding the landscape what it is. It reminds the valley that it is a valley. It reminds the floodplain that it is a floodplain. It reminds the city that its boundaries are drawn on a surface that is still moving, still settling, still listening to older laws. And after the water recedes, there is silt on the street, like ash after a fire. There are small rearrangements, the quiet signature of the river's wider body. The city cleans and repairs and reasserts its geometry, because that is what cities do. They rehearse permanence. They rehearse control. They rehearse the belief that the future can be made predictable by building enough walls. The river's language is revision. A river channel might stay in place for decades, even centuries, then suddenly change course during a single flood, cutting through a low spot and choosing a shorter path. The abandoned bend becomes a crescent scar. The new channel becomes the main sentence. The city, if it built too close to the old line, wakes to find that the world has been edited overnight. In those edits, the idea of ownership becomes thin, almost translucent. The river is not stealing. The river is not reclaiming its land as though it kept deeds in a drawer. The river is simply occupying the lowest available route for the volume it carries. The land, always listening, offers that route. So what looks like a battle between human design and natural flow is, in deeper time, only a mismatch of tempos. A city's plans are made on the scale of budgets, elections, lifetimes. A river's plans, if they can be called plans, are made on the scale of seasons, centuries, and the slow drift of sediment. The river does not rush to undo walls. It only waits until the walls become the easiest way to fail. Time doesn't pass, it weakens. Concrete cracks, metal corrodes, foundations settle. Foundations settle. Small faults in design, invisible at first, become invitations. The river does not need to be strong to enter an invitation. It only needs to be persistent. And persistence is what water has in abundance. This persistence is why river valleys gather ghosts. Not only the ghosts of abandoned cities, but the ghosts of abandoned intentions. Canals that silted in, straightened channels that curved again, levees that were raised and raised until they stood like desperate prayers, then were overtopped in silence. The landscape becomes littered with the remnants of human certainty, subtle, half-buried, softened into the earth until they look like they were always part of it. So the mind returns inevitably to the haunting premise that perhaps the rivers are following a hidden map, but perhaps the map is simply the shape of what lasts. Straight lines do not last on a living floodplain. Curves last longer because curves belong to flow. Curves cooperate with the unevenness of the world. Curves allow the river to wander, to spread its energy, to deposit and erode in a rhythm that does not require sudden rupture. A meandering river is not indecisive. It is distributing itself. It is finding a balanced way to move. Balance is not stillness. Balance is motion that does not break itself. So when humans force rivers into straightness, the river becomes unbalanced. It speeds up, it deepens its bed, it carries more sediment farther, it erodes differently. It begins to change the valley in ways that might not have happened under its older curving grammar. The attempted control becomes a new kind of instability. And still, the river continues. It continues under bridges. It continues through culverts. It continues beneath highways where it is briefly hidden, as if the city hopes that hiding water will make it harmless. But hidden water is not harmless. Hidden water is simply unseen. It still moves. It still searches. It still listens to gravity with the devotion of something that cannot betray its nature. So the city learns, again and again, that water is not a servant. Water is a condition. It is the condition that made fertile soil, the condition that made trade routes possible. the condition that made early settlements plausible. And it is also the condition that makes those settlements temporary. The river gives and takes not as a personality, but as a cycle. The sea doesn't remember, it reclaims. The river doesn't hate, it rearranges. And beneath these rearrangements, the question of the lost civilization's map begins to soften into something more intimate. The recognition that humans too are shaped by the same grammar. Roads branch like tributaries, markets form confluences, neighborhoods spread like deltas. Cities are networks because the world rewards networks. In that reflection, the river becomes a teacher without a voice. It shows what efficiency looks like. It shows what persistence does. It shows what happens when a simple rule is obeyed long enough to carve beauty into matter. But what the planet buried, it never truly forgot. And the next chapter will turn toward the true cartographers, not kings, not engineers, not vanished civilizations, but rain itself, returning in endless drafts, revising the world in soft, unstoppable strokes. Rain arrives as release. A cloud carries what it borrowed from oceans and lakes and leaf breath, then reaches a moment where holding becomes too heavy. The sky too has its limits, so moisture loosens, droplets form, and the world begins again. Its oldest ritual of returning water to the ground so the ground can remember what it is. Rain is not one event. Rain is revision. Each fall is a small edit placed on the surface of the planet, gentle enough to be ignored, powerful enough, when repeated, to remap continents. A river network looks ancient and deliberate because rain returns more faithfully than any builder. It drafts and redrafts the same corridors until they deepen into certainty. It teaches slopes to confess their weaknesses. It teaches stones to surrender grain by grain, until the surrendered becomes a valley, and the valley becomes a guide. If a lost civilization ever tried to leave a permanent map, rain would be the older hand that traced over it, not out of spite, out of habit, out of the slow insistence of gravity's grammar. A map on paper is confident because paper does not flow, but Earth is not paper. Earth is a moving page. The crust lifts and settles. Sediment drifts like thought. Roots pry at cracks. Frost splits rock open with quiet patience, and then rain returns and tests every surface the way a finger tests fabric for weakness. Where the fabric yields, the finger goes again. This is how the planet learns without mind. A single storm can seem like noise, a temporary drumming on roofs, a brief darkening of streets. But the planet does not hear storms as interruptions. The planet hears storms as instruction. Water arrives and seeks the lowest paths. It forms sheet flow on slopes, thin and wide, sliding like a whispered veil. Where the surface is slightly lower, the veil thickens. Where the surface is slightly softer, it deepens. Where it meets a small channel already carved by older rain, it slips in as if returning home. The home is not built, the home is chosen by repetition. In this way, rain is the true cartographer, not because it intends to draw, but because it cannot stop drawing. Each storm adds to the map the way each night adds to memory, not as a neat story, but as layered residue. Channels deepen, banks sharpen. Divides become clearer. The land's invisible bowl, the drainage basin, becomes more coherent with each return. Time doesn't pass, it accumulates. Rain is time made audible. It arrives in pulses, and each pulse leaves behind tiny rearrangements too small to mourn. A few grains displaced, a small rill etched into bare soil, a patch of grass flattened and then rising again. In a single night, the changes are subtle. In 1,000 nights, the changes are geography. The map is not drawn once. The map is drawn until it begins to look like it was always there. This is why river networks can feel like inherited design. Because rain has been drafting them longer than imagination has existed to notice. And rain does not draft in clean lines, it drafts in scatter. It drafts in multiplicity. It drops water over a wide surface and lets gravity decide which drops will become neighbours. This is the beginning of branching, many tiny starts gathering into fewer, larger continuations. A storm is a field of beginnings. A river is the field's collected ending. But even endings do not end. Downstream, rain-fed water becomes part of a larger current. It carries what it lifted: mineral dust, broken leaves, the faint blackness of soil, salts that once slept inside rock. It carries the basin's quiet proof that nothing stays where it began. Mountains are slowly transported into oceans. Forests are translated into carbon carried in solution. The continent is being moved grain by grain by a force gentle enough to rest a hand beneath. So rain is not merely water, rain is a moving pen, and the ink is the planet itself. There are nights when rain falls softly and the world barely changes. There are other nights when rain arrives heavy and the land is reminded of its older identity. Dry channels wake. Gullies fill. The sound of water thickens. The river stands up into its floodplain, spreading wider than its usual posture, as if the valley has been called back to a memory it tried to forget. Floods are not new behaviour. Floods are the river speaking its full name. In the flood's wide body, the map is revised quickly. Banks collapse. New shortcuts are cut. Meanders are abandoned. The main channel can shift in a single surge, choosing a path that was always lower but never fully claimed. When the water recedes, the new map remains. The old line becomes a scar. A crescent lake forms where a bend was cut off, holding still water like a closed eye. And then, quietly, rain begins the next draft. Because no map on Earth is final, a river's channel may look stable to a short-lived observer, but it is only a temporary solution. Sediment builds bars that redirect flow. Vegetation stabilizes a bank until undercutting removes it. A landslide dumps debris into a channel and forces water to negotiate a new route. A drought shrinks flow until a smaller thread chooses a slightly different path. Then the next flood reinforces that difference until it becomes the new main story. All of this is cartography without a cartographer. It is the planet's way of finding shape through constraint. So the question, whether waterways follow a lost civilization's map, begins to soften in rain's presence. Because rain reveals a deeper author, not a vanished people, but repetition itself. The laws of fluid movement, the economics of energy, the silent insistence that downhill will always be downhill. Yet the human longing remains, like a candle kept lit in a ruin, because sometimes rivers truly do align with the remnants of old human works, ancient canals, levees, terraces, diversion channels. Sometimes water reoccupies those corridors because they are already cut. Sometimes the planet accepts the human edit and incorporates it into the next draft. But even then, the incorporation is not obedience, it is opportunism. Water uses what is available. If an old canal offers a low path, rain will feed it. If a collapsed embankment creates a new shortcut, rain will test it. If a city's storm drains become the easiest corridor in a heavy downpour, rain will turn streets into brief rivers and teach the built world what low places truly mean. Nothing is immune to being rewritten, not stone. Not asphalt, not names. Rain is the world's quiet insistence that every surface is provisional, and in that insistence there is something strangely soothing, because the mind too is rewritten each night. Memories are rearranged, sharp edges are softened. What seemed permanent in the day becomes less solid in the dark. Sleep is a kind of inner weather, revising the mind the way rain revises land. Patiently, repeatedly, without asking permission, but what the planet buried it never truly forgot, because rain returning again carries the story forward into the next bend, into the way storms choose where to fall, the way climates draw different handwriting across different latitudes, and the way the map changes when the sky changes its habits. Rain has no memory of where it fell last time, but the sky carries habits. Warm water lifting into air, cooling into clouds, drifting on winds that follow pressure like sleep follows exhaustion. Moisture travels in long, invisible corridors braided through the atmosphere, rivers made of vapor moving above forests and deserts, above oceans that do not keep what they hold. When release finally comes, it is not random in the way a mind imagines randomness. It is guided by temperature, by altitude, by the slow architecture of mountains that wrinkle the air and force it to rise. So rain arrives with a kind of inevitability, not the inevitability of a plan, the inevitability of constraint. A mountain range is a quiet hand held up to the sky. Air meets it and is lifted, cooled, pressed into condensation. Water falls more on one side than the other, and the land below learns two different futures. One side grows soft with rivers, the other side grows dry, holding only brief channels that wake in storms and sleep again for months, sometimes years. The same planet, the same gravity, and yet two different handwritings, because the sky's habits differ over a ridge. Climate is the long mood of rain, not a single storm, not a single season, but the repeating pattern of how often water returns, how heavy it arrives, how long it pauses. Where rain is steady, rivers can become confident, carving deeper, organizing basins into intricate networks that feel like carefully drawn lace. Where rain is rare but violent, the land can be scored by sudden cuts. Gullies and arroyos, channels that look newly made even when they are ancient, because they spend most of their lives empty, waiting. In both cases, the map is still being written. Only the pace changes. In a humid place, the edits are continuous, gentle, persistent. In an arid place, the edits arrive like brief, intense revisions. Pages rewritten in a single night of heavy rainfall, then left to dry and harden as if the land is holding its breath between sentences. Time doesn't pass, it pulses. And each pulse does the same quiet work. It tests the surface. Rain touches rock and soil and built pavement with the same indifference. It searches for depressions, for cracks, for places that give way. It does not aim, but it finds. It finds the gutter because it is low. It finds the culvert because it is open. It finds the ditch because it is already a wound. It finds the old channel scar because the scar is still a bias in the land's posture. So the map persists, not as intention, as preference. A single storm can reveal the hidden map more clearly than any satellite image, because water reveals the routes of least resistance by moving through them in real time. In heavy rain, streets become brief tributaries. Parking lots become shallow lakes. Underpasses become basins. The built world is temporarily returned to hydrology, and the illusion of separation between city and river becomes thin. Concrete does not end drainage. It only redirects it. So rain becomes a teacher. Quiet, unbothered, showing that all surfaces still belong to gravity. Every drop is still a vote for downhill. And when enough drops arrive at once, The voting becomes a flood. Floods write quickly. They do what gentle rain does, only faster. They widen channels. They remove banks. They deposit bars of sediment in new places. They carve shortcuts across meanders and abandon old loops. They move boulders that seemed immovable. They place logs across channels like sudden new punctuation, forcing water to split and reunite, until the flow finds a new sentence it prefers. Afterward, the river looks as though it has made a decision, but the decision was made by constraint and opportunity, not by thought. Still, the mind cannot help itself. When change happens quickly, it looks purposeful. When a river abandons one channel and chooses another, it resembles intention the way a dream resembles meaning. In the dream, everything feels connected, arranged, guided. Upon waking, the arrangement dissolves. The landscape is like that, but slower. A flood is a brief waking. Then the river returns to its quieter posture, and rain resumes its gentler drafting. In the days and months afterward, the river begins to refine what the flood initiated. Banks stabilize. Vegetation returns. Small flows adjust the roughness of the new channel, smoothing it, deepening it, making it more efficient. The quick draft becomes a polished sentence. This polishing is what makes the world feel ancient. Not because it is old in years alone, but because it is old in repetition. The same storms return, the same slopes offer the same guidance, the same weaknesses in rock are tested again and again. Over long spans, the land becomes optimized for water's movement, and optimization looks like design. Optimization is a kind of beauty born from fatigue. The planet gets tired of fighting itself, so it settles into pathways that cost less. Valleys deepen where flow insists. Divides sharpen where flow is absent. Channels become hierarchies, tiny threads feeding larger ones, until the whole basin resembles a nervous system laid over stone. And yet, rain is never perfectly consistent. Habits can shift. The sky can change its mood across centuries. Wet periods come, dry periods follow, cold ages arrive with ice, then retreat. Sea levels rise and fall, changing how far rivers must travel before meeting saltwater. Uplift can lift a plateau, steepening gradients and giving rivers new energy. Subsidence can lower land, flattening slopes and encouraging wandering. When these larger changes happen, the map is rewritten more profoundly. A river that once carved deep can begin to deposit instead, building up its bed, raising itself above its floodplain like a tired animal climbing onto a mound. A delta can advance outward during low sea levels, then retreat when seas rise, drowning old channels and turning former land into estuary. Nothing is final. Even the most confident river is only temporary handwriting on a moving page. So the question about lost civilizations begins to feel less like a mystery to solve and more like a lullaby to hold. The longing to find an author in the lines of water is the longing to believe in permanence. But rain teaches impermanence gently. It teaches that every line is drawn again. It teaches that even if an ancient people once cut canals and traced boundaries, those lines would become part of the planet's draft, used when they are low, erased when they resist, folded into the larger grammar of flow. Water uses what is easiest. Time preserves what repeats. In that quiet partnership, rain arriving, gravity guiding, land yielding, the planet creates patterns that resemble maps, not because it is trying to mislead, but because efficiency produces shapes that feel intentional. The resemblance is the mirror between human planning and natural optimization, and perhaps this is where the most soothing truth waits. If rivers look like language, it is because language and rivers share the same origin, constraint shaping flow. The mouth shapes breath into words because the mouth has limits. The land shapes rain into rivers because the land has slopes. Neither needs a lost civilization to be sacred, but what the planet buried, it never truly forgot, because the next part drifts toward the gentlest paradox of all, how rain's scatter becomes the basin's coherence, and how coherence can feel like memory even when no mind is remembering. A river's ending is never an ending, it is a loosening, a surrender of certainty into spread, the way a thought dissolves at the edge of sleep, the way a name becomes a feeling when it is repeated too many times in the dark. The river approaches the sea carrying everything it has borrowed, grains of mountain, powdered cliff, the faint sweetness of forests turned into carbon, the invisible salts of stone made drinkable, and then made strange again. And as the river nears salt water, the world changes its rules without announcing it. The land flattens, the current begins to slow, not out of hesitation, but because the slope, the river's oldest instruction, softens into almost nothing. The river has been running downhill for so long that it forgets what it means to fall quickly. Now it arrives at a place where down becomes subtle, where gravity still pulls but cannot command speed the way it does in the high country. The river begins to widen, it begins to breathe outward. This is the delta, not a point. A spreading. A sentence that refuses a final period. Water slows, and in slowing it releases. Sediment, carried so faithfully for so many miles, begins to settle. First the heavier grains, then the finer ones, then the silts, so light they seem like memory itself. They fall through the water column in silence and land on the delta's floor like ash after a fire that no one witnessed. Layer by layer the river builds land from what it stole upstream. A delta is land made of loss. It is the continent returning itself to the sea, but not all at once. The river negotiates. It arrives with cargo, lays some of it down, then returns to fetch more, again and again, until the shoreline is no longer where it used to be. The river's mouth migrates, new channels form, old channels clog with sediment and become wetlands. Marsh grasses arrive like quiet guardians, holding mud in place with roots, stitching the delta together so it can last a little longer. Still, lasting is not the delta's true talent. The delta exists in a state of almost falling apart. It is built by deposition and undone by waves, tides, storms, and the slow hunger of salt water for fresh water's shape. The sea does not admire the river's architecture. The sea accepts it the way the sea accepts everything, by stirring it, reclaiming it, dissolving its edges until the boundary between river and ocean becomes a wide, brackish hush. The sea doesn't remember. It reclaims, so the delta is a place where memory is constantly being written and constantly being erased, a place where the river tries to keep its sentences intact, and the ocean keeps softening the words until they become something else. This is why deltas feel haunted. They are young land, and yet they are made of ancient material. They are fertile, and yet they are fragile. They are generous, and yet they are temporary. They offer soil deep enough to feed cities, and they also offer the quiet certainty that those cities will someday be swallowed by subsidence, by flooding, by the slow rise of the sea, by the river shifting its mouth as easily as a sleeping body shifts in bed. A delta invites settlement the way a floodplain does, with softness, with abundance, with the illusion of permanence created by the shortness of a single lifetime. And so, again, humans arrive. They arrive drawn by water's generosity and by the flatness that makes building easy. They arrive by boat and road, by trade and hunger, by the old understanding that where a river meets the sea, Everything can be exchanged. Goods, stories, languages, diseases, prayers. Deltas become crossroads not because anyone planned them, but because flow converges there, from upstream and from ocean, until the place becomes dense with possibility. But possibility is not stability. A delta is always settling. The sediments that build it are loose, waterlogged, compressible. Under the weight of buildings and roads and levees, the delta slowly sinks. It sinks even without buildings because new mud presses on old mud, squeezing water out, compacting the layers the way time compacts memories into something quieter. The surface lowers by degrees too small to notice day to day, yet large enough to matter over decades. The sea notices. The sea is patient. The sea waits. And the river, still faithful to gravity, continues to bring more sediment, but sometimes not enough. Sometimes the river is trapped behind levees and cannot spill its nourishing mud across the wetlands. Sometimes the river is dammed upstream and arrives with clearer water, less cargo, less ability to build new land at its mouth. The delta, starved of sediment, becomes thinner. It becomes more vulnerable. It begins to erode faster than it can be rebuilt. This is the delta's sorrow. It is land that must be continually fed by the river's loss in order to remain land at all. Time doesn't pass, it starves, and in that starvation, the delta's channels shift like restless dreams. Water finds new paths. A distributary breaks off, carrying flow into a different wetland, building new ground there, while the old channel silts up and becomes still. From above, the delta looks like branching again, like the river remembering its own grammar at the edge of the sea. But this branching is softer than upstream branching. It is less decisive. It is the river dispersing itself, as if it cannot bear to end in only one place. The river becomes many mouths, many whispers, many last breaths, and then the ocean takes them. Salt water mixes in, tides push upstream, the river's fresh certainty becomes brackish ambiguity. The water tastes different. Life changes. Creatures adapted to salt hover at the edges. Creatures adapted to freshwater retreat. Mangroves and marsh grasses hold the line for as long as they can, filtering sediment, calming waves, building quiet walls of root and mud. The delta becomes an in-between world, neither river nor sea, neither land nor water, neither permanence nor disappearance. This in-between is where the idea of lost maps becomes most poignant, because if a civilization ever tried to mark the world with lines meant to last, a delta would be where those lines dissolve first. The ground itself moves, channels shift, shorelines migrate. What is drawn cannot hold. What is built cannot insist. The delta teaches the oldest lesson, that endings are not places, they are processes. Some truths are not lost, they are simply folded beneath silence. The river's language at the delta is not crisp, it is blurred by tides and softened by settling. It is spoken in sediment plumes, in shifting channels, in wetlands forming and drowning, in the slow exchange between fresh and salt. And still, the river continues to write, because writing on this planet is not about permanence. It is about return.